After 20 years of building together through dust, deadlines, and damn good ideas, Pace and Adam invite you to join them for honest conversations about the home building world. Welcome to Build Connected, where experience meets insight, powered by Diamond Home Restoration.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Build Connected. We're here on episode 5 with myself, Adam, and I'm here with Pace. And we're going to cover our usual topics. But, look, there was a little controversy last time. We got into some of the building codes, and there was some feedback, and we're going to dive into that a little more because it was requested by some folks. But don't worry, we'll tap into that, and there might be some more heated arguments down the road with that. Always fun stuff. But
yeah, we'll definitely do a recurring segment in the future on building code issues. Builders love to talk about this. So every once in a while we'll come back and we'll pick on a code that deserves to be picked on. And it'll be tons of fun.
On this week's episode, we're going to dive into some products we like, specifically pocket doors. Pace is going to talk more about building the team. And we'll talk a little bit about some common things that are going on most of our projects that involve the WUI zone. So let's just dive right in. I don't know, is there, Pace, anything you want to talk about how your week went before we get into some business here?
Well, it was Memorial Day weekend, so we had the extended family over for barbecue. We did a new outdoor kitchen gazebo area in the backyard last year, so it's always nice taking advantage of that. Throwing some veggie burgers on the grill. Yeah, that's good stuff. Hopefully everybody out there had a good Memorial Day, but it was a nice weekend.
Nice. Okay. I see we got another different Boston hat we're rocking today. We won't get into that. Let's dive into one of the products that Pace and I like today, and that is pocket doors. So, look, we've all experienced pocket doors, and they used to have a pretty bad rap, and, honestly, it was well deserved. The problem with all these old pocket doors is they would get jammed. The hardware isn't accessible. So whenever you need to make an adjustment, it's a real pain to get in there and deal with that. The other thing about pocket doors and some of the negative things about them, besides the maintenance, is insulation. You can't insulate these walls with the pockets, but there's not really any way around that because sometimes you have no choice and you need to go with a pocket. But look, if you're going to go with one of these pocket doors, we suggest going with HD pocket doors. HD stands for heavy duty. This company, HD Pocket Doors, we're not sponsored by these guys. They just make a great product. We have great experience using it. Once we found this door, there was really nothing else that fit the bill for us. There's other competitors out there that are also good, but not quite at this level. When we order one from these guys, they're based out of Arizona, and I think the owner was used to be a general contractor, and he wanted to develop a better pocket door, and he went out and he did it. So, his kits, they're not these flimsy pockets anymore. He has tube steel that comes down to replace kind of the flimsy wood posts that these usually came with. His headers are integrated into his pockets, and they're made of LVLs. So it's like a laminated veneer lumber, super straight, super heavy duty. They're bomber. And if these doors ever need adjustment, they've developed a way for you to remove one of the strips of wood to easily access the rolling hardware and make any adjustments that you need. Because look, these things move. It's inevitable. They really developed lots of different options with their doors. Not only do they offer slow close and slow open, so you're not slamming these things open and close, but they have what's called their synchro door. It's designed for a double pocket door. So when you open one side, the other side will open simultaneously. It's a really cool feature. We've used it on one of our jobs, and it worked beautifully. So look, if you're in the market for a pocket door, I think that this is the best option. You're going to spend a little bit more money with these. Typically, you're probably in the $350, $400 range for your typical pocket. These are roughly $1,200, give or take, depending on what style you go with, and that doesn't include the door itself either. So, be ready for that, but I'm telling you, it's definitely worth the price. You'll be happy with these in the long run. I
Yeah,
think,
I've hated pocket doors my entire life. The only thing worse than a pocket door is a bifold door. So we'll work on that in the future. But these pocket doors, they're nice. I mean, my only comment, and maybe you can kind of weigh in on this, is prep for the hardware with certain kinds of hardware can be very finicky. But function of the door, the way they're built is it's just hard to beat. So when you don't have the room for a traditional door swing, and you got to go with the pocket, this is the way to go for sure.
yeah, you're right, Pace. There are lots of good options though with door hardware. We'll get into that on a later episode and discuss mortising hardware in or not. There's just so many options we can cover. But why don't you go ahead and jump in and start discussing some of your team building things that you want to dive into?
Well, let's talk value engineering. It's one of those terms that sounds great until it means slashing for the sake of the budget. But if your team's balanced from the beginning, the conversation shifts. Now you're looking at how to maintain the feel and the look just with smarter choices. Maybe it's an alternate material. Maybe it's a change in the sequencing that saves on labor. Or maybe it's just a subtle change that reduces fabrication time, without it affecting the final aesthetic. Or yeah, sometimes it means scaling back on the overall scope. When the builder, architect, and client are solving the puzzle together, you can trim the budget without gutting the vision. And that's where the win is. Here's the real truth that no one wants to say out loud. When you bring your builder in late, they're often treated like a commodity. At that point, it's less about what they're bringing to the table, and it's more about, hey, what's your number? And when that happens, the temptation becomes, can we find somebody that's cheaper? But here's the thing. Builders, they're not interchangeable. When we're involved early, we become creative collaborators and not just cost checkers. We understand the goals of the project, what the constraints are, what the homeowner priorities are. And that helps with reasoning to find better decisions. That kind of engagement on the project, it's not just more productive, it's just more respectful. It values the builder as being part of the team and not just the guy in the field banging nails.
Yeah, the truth is, it sucks as a contractor when you come into a project late in the game. You can feel there's tension sometimes with an architect or even an engineer. We've been in that position where you're kind of being talked down to because you are treated like you're saying, almost like a commodity, and it's not fun. And sometimes you grit your teeth and bear it because you don't want to stir the pot per se. But
Yeah, and I think if you're the homeowner and you're not aware of this tension, you're spending all this money on a big project, right? You've in your mind put together this team. You've selected people based on what they do. To know that they're fighting or at least a bit adversarial in the background, that's the last thing that you want. You want your team working as a well-oiled machine together in your best interest.
yeah, I mean, what happens, this kind of negativity that we're talking about is when you come in late to these projects, the architect and engineer, they've got their plan in place and they feel so strongly about it. And as a contractor, if we kind of discuss adjustments, they get offended. It happens, right? And like I said, you don't want to stir the pot, so you just kind of let things be a little bit, and that's not the right way to handle these situations. Like Pace is saying, when you're part of that team early, these discussions just they happen automatically without even thinking. That relationship, that bond is created with the entire team, and it's such a friendly environment and a friendly dynamic, and people can hear each other instead of someone coming in at the end and wanting to make adjustments to your overall plan that you had.
Yeah. And the last thing that I think any good builder wants is to change a design vision, right? Like our objective is not to just cut scope, but our first priority is to make sure that we're hitting homeowner budgets. Like if you can't do that, then your client will not be smiling at the end of the project. And ultimately that is what a good project is. A happy client when the project is finished. And this is one of those things we're going to keep coming back to on future episodes. And it's really similar to the thing that you're going to talk about next, Adam. You're going to get into the fire resistant stuff, WUI compliancy. You're gonna jump into this topic for the first time on this show. And again, we'll come back on many episodes because it's such a pressing issue in California.
Yeah, we're getting that part of the podcast where we want to discuss something interesting on a project. And really, today we're tackling something that's not just important, it's essential if you live in a wildfire prone area. And it comes into play in most of our projects now. It's all about WUI zones. WUI is an acronym. It stands for Wildland Urban Interface. On a lot of our projects, we are now required to comply with WUI approved products. So, look, let's start with the basics here about WUI zones, right? It's the space where residential development meets wildland vegetation. Think of your neighborhoods that back up to the hills, forests, brushland. I live in a WUI zone here in California, but here's the problem. WUI zones are ground zero for wildfire risk. They're areas that combine dense housing, dry vegetation, and limited emergency access. So, that's a super dangerous mix. And unfortunately, we've seen what happens when the fire hits these areas that are unprepared. So in California and in many other states, WUI zones are regulated by strict building codes to, reduce these fire hazards. And trust me, these aren't just suggestions. If you're building or remodeling in a WUI area, compliance is absolutely mandatory, and you won't get a permit without meeting these codes. So building codes for WUI zones focus on two main things. There's fire-resistant materials and ember protection. And today we're going to talk about vents. Here's why standard vents are dangerous. During a wildfire, you have these embers that travel for miles with the wind. And if those embers get in your attic or your crawl space through a standard vent, that's often how these homes ignite. They ignite from the inside out. So standard vents like the one you find in most homes, they do absolutely nothing to stop that. And they're cheap. They're maybe $5, $10, $20 each, but they let the embers right through. And that's why in WUI zones, these standard vents are no longer legal. What we use is a product made by Vulcan. They're called Vulcan Vents, and it's basically a honeycomb pattern that restricts embers from entering the vent. They're really, really tight, overwoven kind of metal that you find in these vents. And so we use these anywhere where we need one. In soffits, where we need soffit vents, we'll have to use these. Here in California, we have a lot of crawl spaces, so we use them for crawl space vents. You may not have crawl spaces where you are. But this is the solution, and this is also mandatory for WUI zones.
Yeah, I think the other thing that it's forced us to do is we've really moved away from vented attic assemblies, vented roof assemblies, where we're typically just insulating that area and we're getting rid of the air filtration altogether. The other thing that's been interesting is the first 20 years you and I were only building in San Francisco. And there were tons of fire concerns in San Francisco because of zero setbacks on the lots in the city. But now up here, in Marin and Sonoma, these WUI zones, it's such a hot issue. We're doing our best to build fire resistant structures. It's probably the biggest focus in our area.
You're right, Pace. Anytime we're doing a large remodel, we really try to achieve air tightness in a home, and we can get away without using any of these vents. But for the most part, if you're not able to do a large remodel and you have to replace some of your old vents, the Vulcan vent is what you're going to be required to use. Typically on our podcast, we don't really want to get into costs of things because it's very regional in terms of labor costs and that sort of thing. But just to give you a sense of pricing on these Vulcan vents, if you were to buy them online, typically, like I said, maybe you're spending $10, $20 for a standard vent. You're probably more in the $100 to $120 range for one of these Vulcan vents. So they're quite a bit more, but I don't know. What choice do you have? All right. Well, that covers it for today's podcast. We did it. We completed episode 5. Payson and I are having a lot of fun doing this, and we want to thank you for listening. So tune in next time for podcast number 6, and you can hear more about our hot topics, whether it's products, something cool we're doing on a project, or something Pace might want to vent about. That's it. We'll talk to you later. I'm Adam.
I'm Pace. See ya.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us on Build Connected. For more stories, insights, and ideas, visit diamondhomerestoration.com or find us on Instagram and LinkedIn. We'll be back next week. We hope you will too.